Hi, it's Kim from the Shamrock Quilt Studio, and today we're working on the hand quilting of our Miss Kelly quilt. Join us. I've got some important tips to share. And welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Hi, it's Kim. We're back and we're starting on the hand quilting for this Miss Kelly project. Now, I have put it on my Grace EZ3 frame, which is a device that allows me to sandwich this quilt and actually do the hand quilting without having to baste it or to pin it. So let me show you a little bit of the basics of this. I don't really have the room to show you how it's loaded, but I'll try to talk you through it a little bit. And there may be some videos online that go a little more in depth in how this is done, or directions. I had directions that came with my frame when I purchased it. And at one time they were talking about discontinuing this. I'm not sure if they have or not. But if you're interested in something like this, they're available on the secondary market or used. And I will tell you that it compacts pretty small. This is probably about 48 inches wide, how I have it now. I have done a quilt that was 92 inches wide on it. It was a king size, roughly, quilt, and I put it on the narrowest way and had it run the longest way. And it was a very tight fit, but it did work. And I was thankful for that, because something that big would be just about impossible in a hoop. And that's why I'm not doing this one in a hoop, because this quilting is all going to be straight lines for the most part, except for some of the echo quilting around the designs. So we want it to be something that we can quilt a lot without having to move that hoop over and over again. And the hoop is kind of want to distort it just a little bit because it's round, and we want to avoid that. Okay, so back to how it works. There are 3 rollers on this, and they have little leaders, they call it. And let's see where you can see it. There's a little fabric here that attaches to these aluminum bars, and you pin your fabric on there. So it's very convoluted, but basically what you do is you have your backing fabric here, you have your batting, and you have your quilt top. And they are all pinned here at the bottom closest to you. And then the backing fabric is rolled around the center pole, and the batting and the quilt top are on the top. So that's how it works. And as you quilt, you roll this down, and it pulls it, and it keeps it as loose or as tight as you want. A lot of people, when they're hand quilting, like it pretty loose. I've heard it described, if you're using a hoop, of as loose as it would be if a cat sat on it. They do like it loose. I prefer mine a little snugger, a little taut. I can tell on this one the backing is pretty snug, and that allows me to keep this backing fabric pulled snugly, and the batting as well. And if I'm working on something and I notice that I've got creases or folds in that batting or backing, I do have some clamps that I can put on here and pull it just a little bit to give it just a little bit of tension on it to keep it smooth. This one right now feels like it's pretty good, and I can run a hand on the top and a hand on the bottom and feel where there's a little fold, and see there's one there where that seam is, and there's another one right there. So I can investigate, and it's just a little fold in the backing fabric. So we're in good shape. Now I've already done one little line of stitches here. I don't know if you can see that very clearly. I'm using a between needle. I don't use as tiny of a needle as some hand quilters. And I also don't use a rocking stitch. I use something kind of like a stab stitch, and I'm going to show you that. So I like to quilt from right to left because I'm right-handed, and that's really just a personal preference more than anything. I've got like a medium-sized knot on this thread, and I am using a single piece of thread to sew with, so it's got a loose end and then the end with the knot. I've come up underneath the applique because I am using an applique, and I've got that knot, and I'm going to pull that knot under the applique piece, and now it's embedded either on top of that fabric or between that fabric and that batting, and that I can tell is going to hold it. If you're not working on applique, you can go in through a seam. You could also go in through the edge of the fabric and catch it. I would tell you, if you have the ability to get that knot in the batting, it's going to hold better than just getting getting the knot under the fabric on top. And you want to avoid being able to see that knot from the bottom too. So now we've got this knot somewhere underneath that fabric. It's holding pretty well. And then I'm going to just start stitching. And it's like having performance anxiety here. I'm going to be stitching for you. And then I pull it through on the bottom and then come back up and pull it on the top. This is also one of the reasons that I prefer this frame, is because the way that I quilt, it makes it easier for me to be able to do it. Sometimes I can use two hands, and usually that's after I've quilted a while. It has been a few months since I quilted actually, since I quilted anything on this frame, it's been over 2 years, so that gives you an idea. The last thing I quilted has been a couple of months ago, and that was in a hoop. Okay, so we've gotten started, and I've got a couple of stitches. One thing I use to make sure that my stitches stay pretty even is I take a little piece of this mylar that has a grid on it. I found this at Joann's in the section where they have the quilting tools. If you're going to make your own pattern, that's a great thing to use. And you see it's got a grid in 1/8 of an inch, and then it's marked there for 1/4 and 1 inch too by the width of the lines. So I can use this to see whether my stitches are about where I want them to be or not, either as a check or as a guide. If I'm working on something that's not marked and I want a straight line, I use it as a guide. I sometimes punch holes in it and pin it into place, and then I can stitch along that very quickly. And it keeps my line straight. With this, I've already marked it, so I don't need that. And for the most part, I can kind of look at it and tell where I want those stitches, how big I want them to be. Now, right here down at the bottom where we have connected the border to the quilt top, you're going to have a little bit of a seam and a knot, apparently. I do find sometimes that if I use a little beeswax on this, it works better. There we go. And if you find your stitches are out of whack, take them out. Just back those things out of there. And just like that, we're going to need a pair of scissors. Just like that, you can take them out. Beeswax for your thread, your extra thread, your needle. Let me get a pair of scissors. Okay, so we're back. I found some scissors, and I just clipped off the knotted up thread, and I looked, and where I pulled it out of the eye of the needle and pulled it back through the fabric, there was a little place where the thread had began to fuzz up or have a little imperfection in it, so I clipped that off too. So we're back down to a nice clean piece of thread, and then we'll do that stitch over again. And if you'll bear with me, we'll get down to the end and we will knot it and finish that up. Depending on your preference, you may like long stretches of stitching, or you may like little short stretches like we have here. You can travel between spot to spot. I don't like to do it unless it's pretty small. I would say under 1/2 inch maybe. Anything larger than that, you may have to pop that needle up somewhere and then hide it again, which I don't really find that enjoyable, but it is necessary sometimes. And also I was going to tell you that because on this particular design, our border is only about 3.5 inches wide. The border here comes up around the pole and it ends right there. So underneath it, it's not going to get caught in our stitches but we do have it rolled down pretty low. So you just need to feel underneath there and make sure you're not catching anything extra under, because if you do, you probably won't recognize that till the very end, and it will be difficult to resolve that. Normally I wouldn't quilt quite this far down, but that's the way with this particular border it went. Now, there we go. That's our last stitch in this row. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up where the line would be, right on the seam for the border. All right, and then I'm going to put a knot that sits as close to the fabric as possible. So it was 2 little individual knots right there on top of each other. And there's the knot sitting right there. I don't know if you can see that or not. What I'm going to do is take this thread now and point it and stick it between the border and the backing. So it means you need to get right there at the seam between stitches. And I'm going to have it come in so that it goes through the batting but not through the backing, and then comes back up through the top fabric. So there's the knot. It's going under between the 2 fabrics that make up that seam, through the batting underneath, and then back up through the fabric. And then we're going to pull that, and then you're going to hear a little pop. It's very soft. You might not have heard it. So now the knot is buried in that seam, and it's also the thread is through the batting, so it's not going to pull out as easily. And then we're just going to trim that right at the fabric, and it's completely invisible. Now I can feel on the back side that line of stitches, they're pretty much even. I've got this little tool that I use to monitor my stitch length. Now usually in projects like this, I like my stitch length not to be a little tiny hand quilting stitch length. I like it to be a little bit bigger, but not quite what I would call big stitch either. So these little boxes are 1/8 of an inch. So what I usually do on the stitch on the top is come up and then go down just on the other side of that line for 8 inch. So it's a little bigger than 8 inch, but it's not 1/4 of an inch. And then the seam on the back side, judging from what I'm seeing on top, is a little bit less than 1 inch. So tiny stitches on the back and about 1/8 inch stitches on the front. And that seems to work well. All the quilts that I've done using stitches that are about that big do hold up well, they wash well. You don't typically get anything stuck in the stitches because they're small enough that it's going to be rare that you get something in that seam or in that stitch to pull it. So very basics on our hand quilting. We may come back here and do a little segment on the echo quilting around this flower before we move on. I think this is going to be fairly quickly. You saw how quickly that little seam went. And when you're doing long stretches and you kind of get into the rhythm of how you're doing it and the length of your stitch, and maybe you're listening to a TV show or some favorite music, or like I have beautiful outdoors that I can look at and watch the birds, it goes really quickly, I think. And so I think this is going to go together fairly quickly. And then once we get it done, I'm going to decide what I want to do about quilting in the borders. And I think I have a solution to how to display this. I ran across something out shopping yesterday that once I get it off the frame, I can see if it fits. And if it does, we're going to have some fun with it in the studio. So be sure to join us next time when we're finishing up or working on this hand quilting on this project, Miss Kelly. In the meantime, like us if there was something about this video that you like. If you can, share it with somebody who enjoys hand quilting or likes this beautiful pattern. And be sure to subscribe. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so we can continue to bring you videos every week on this project. Right now, these are popping up on Fridays, so we'll see you next Friday here at the Shamrock Quilt Studio.